So I'm going to walk quickly through a case study I wrote demonstrating the use of the OpenAI service library to instruct ChatGPT to perform sentiment analysis reactively on famous quotes from William Shakespeare. And you can get this source code that I'll go through here briefly at the link at the bottom of the slide. So what's happening here is we're going to go ahead and have the client application on the left-hand side send some messages over to the microservice shown on the right-hand side, where they're going to get random quotes from William Shakespeare. We'll talk briefly about how I get that in a second. And then we're going to go ahead and take those random quotes and ship them off over to another microservice, which is a GPT sentiment analyzer. And it's going to take the request that comes in, and it's going to go ahead and make a RESTful API call to the OpenAI ChatGPT service running out somewhere in the internet. So now we're in my IntelliJ project that contains the source code for this simple example. I want to show you first the data that we're using here. This was actually generated by ChatGPT. I went to ChatGPT and I said, please generate me 100 famous quotes from William Shakespeare and put it into the data.sql format with the name of the play first, followed by the quote. You can see we have Hamlet with to be or not to be, that is the question, and Hamlet, brevity is the soul of wit, and so on and so forth. And it actually generates all the code here, including the code that inserts this into an SQL schema, which we can see over here. So ChatGPT is generating all the input for the program. What I then do is I have a test program over here, which is going to go ahead and send a request using the RSocket reactive mechanism for messaging in the Spring Web framework. And we're going to go ahead and send a request to get some random Shakespeare quotes. And when we get those quotes back, we're going to go ahead and send them over to a microservice that will analyze the sentiment of those quotes. And this is all done in a very cool reactive way with non-blocking processing using Project Reactor, but I'm not going to focus on that right now. If we take a look over here on the receiver side of this, we see the use of what's called annotation-based programming. And this is actually something that appears in the SCI National Study on Software, the Software Agenda study we did a couple years ago. And you basically can program things by using annotations. So a lot of the low-level marshaling and demarshaling and security and configuration and auto wiring and dependency injection and so on is all handled magically for you by the Spring framework. In this case, we get a quote, and a quote is basically a data transfer object that contains the name of a Shakespeare play like Hamlet or Macbeth, a quote from that play like to be or not to be, that is the question. And then there's something called the sentiment. And the sentiment is not filled in yet. That's what the ChatGPT sentiment service is going to do. So we take the quote, and then we go ahead and we analyze the sentiment of that quote. And this, again, is written using the RSocket reactive programming mechanism. I'm not going to spend much time on that, but basically we take the request that comes in, and the first thing we do is we take the quote we've got, and we go ahead and make ourselves a list of chat messages by calling a method that I wrote called makePrompt. So makePrompt uses the OpenAI service capability, which we actually configure into our system using Spring annotations and auto wiring mechanisms. So this basically says, when we start up, go ahead and create an instance of the OpenAI service that's bound to my private API key, and then that's going to be auto-wired into the application right here. So notice there's no use of constructors. This is all done with Spring's dependency injection, which again is a bit beyond the point of this, but it's just kind of cool to show how you can write reactive code that's annotated and so on to reduce the amount of clutter you have to deal with in your code. So down here, we go ahead and create a chat message, which comes from the OpenAI service library, generating the following prompt. This is code that I wrote, and I basically say, please analyze the sentiment of this quote, and I give it the quote from this play. I give it the play, and I say in one paragraph with no more than 3 sentences. And this is actually the request that's going to be sent from my microservice over to the ChatGPT microservice running out in the cloud somewhere. And notice I'm always very polite to ChatGPT, and that's because when robots and AI models take over the world, I want them to remember me as a nice person that was polite to them. But anyway, just kidding. So that's the prompt that I get. I put that into a chat message, which is something that comes from the OpenAI service framework. And then I take that message and I call another helper method I wrote called getResult. And this is what actually builds a request to send to ChatGPT and then sends it. So you can see this is the chat completion request builder. This comes from the OpenAI library. We specify the model to use, which is GPT 3.5 Turbo. which is one of the models that's available. We give the prompt here using Fluent programming style. We set the temperature, which controls how deterministic the response will be. We want it to be fairly deterministic, but you can set it to be higher to get more speculative results. Probably not that much of a big deal with Shakespeare quote analysis, but it could be for other things. I only want a single response to come back in return. I build this request, and then I take the request and I call the create chat completion method on this OpenAI service endpoint, and it goes ahead and sends that request over to ChatGPT to do the analysis. What comes back in that case is going to be something that's called a chat completion result, and then I go ahead and take that result and the original quote, and I fish out the content of the result, which of course is going to be the content that comes back from ChatGPT, the string containing the analysis, and I stick it into the sentiment field of the quote, and then I send the quote back to the client. And when it gets back to the client, I'm going to go ahead and display the sentiment analysis. This, interestingly enough, is another program that I use ChatGPT to work on for me. This is formatting the output, so it'll be broken after around 70 characters, so it doesn't go across the screen too far. And all the code here, which is just kind of low-level string processing code, was all generated by ChatGPT. So once again, I didn't have to do the work to write this code very much. Let's go over and see what happens when I run the program. When I run the program, it sends a random quote. Here's a great famous random quote. Et tu, Brute, then fall Caesar. And this is what comes back from ChatGPT, which basically says, the sentiment of this quote is one of betrayal and despair. The use of the phrase et tu, Brute expresses Caesar's shock and disbelief that even his closest friend Brutus would betray him. And then it says, the second part of the quote, then fall Caesar, shows Caesar's acceptance of his fate and his willingness to die rather than to live with the knowledge of Brutus's betrayal. There's some other stuff here too. There's another quote, but I think you get the point. We're able to have a way of getting ChatGPT to do analysis for us. We take the results that come back, and then we feed that back to the client, which could process it and display it or whatever it wants to do with that. If you're interested in seeing more descriptions of this particular application, take a look at this link, which is to a course I'm teaching at Vanderbilt University this year, and take a look at the videos that are from week 15. And this has slides as well as MP4 videos that walk through all the various dimensions of this application, going well beyond the parts we covered here, which was really just focusing on ChatGPT if you want to see more discussions. I will put this link in the description box in this video so you can click on it if you want to learn more about this particular application.